Okay, one of the important things that you do in this module is we have just kind of beat you up on all of these directional terms and all of these looking at different planes of the body, looking at sagittal planes and mid-sagittal planes and looking at frontal and looking at horizontal or transverse. Okay? And it's important that you're able to do that so you know exactly in reference to how are you looking at the body. Well, one of the things we have to do to make sure that you can utilize those terms correctly is, well, you got to know a few organs. Now, we do understand that we're going to come back in the very specific organ systems and discuss each of the components of that organ system. But we at least have to give you a few to think about so that, okay, on your exam, we're going to talk about things that are anterior and posterior and proximal and distal and some of those things. So there are a few major body organs you have to understand, so we're going to go through some of those with you, and those are the ones, so consult your objectives on this, those are the ones you need to know and be able to reference with their neighbors so that we can ask you some of those questions. So as we look at, for example, the nervous system, we looked at the nervous system and we alluded to the fact we can break it up into a central nervous system, okay, that's brain and spinal cord. And then we have everything else that's outside of that. We call that the peripheral nervous system. So your nervous system is made up of a brain and the nerves that arise from it. We call those cranial nerves because they come from the cranial region. We also have the spinal cord and from it the spinal nerves. And some of you are familiar with these. Some of you, due to injury or individuals in your family with injuries, are familiar with these, because we start talking about spinal nerves T1 and C2 and L1 and L2. Okay, those are telling us what region, okay, of the spinal cord they're arising from. The cranial nerves are a little different. You may not have heard of those as frequently. Okay, you've heard of their names, possibly, the optic nerve, the olfactory nerve, the ocular motor nerve, but we enumerate those with Roman numerals. Whenever you see a CN for cranial nerve and then a Roman numeral, it's listing those. Next semester, as we get into the nervous system, yeah, you get the opportunity to memorize those. But do be familiar with the brain and arising from the brain, the cranial nerves, the spinal cord, and arising from the spinal cord, the spinal nerves. So be familiar with those. Two of the glands that we have in our body, okay, common, yeah, pretty much everybody has them unless they've had them removed or unless they're quite a bit older and there's not a whole lot of it left, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But two of those, the thyroid gland, that one's easy to find its location because we have this predominant pair of cartilage that's fused, predominant pair of cartilage plates that are fused. We call the Adam's apple, but it's actually the thyroid cartilage because the thyroid gland sits just lateral and inferior to that Adam's apple. So in the respiratory system, we'll refer to it as the thyroid cartilage, but yeah, we call it the Adam's apple. That's your thyroid gland, and it plays a big role in your metabolism by secreting thyroid hormones. But it is just lateral with two lobes to that thyroid cartilage. Now, inferior to that, in the mediastinum, okay, the cavity within the thoracic cavity that holds your heart and all the structures except for the lungs, within the mediastinum, there's typically a two-lobe gland. Now, it typically starts as three, but one of those lobes atrophies about just before you're born, so you're left with two lobes. And it has its peak at about puberty, and then it starts to atrophy after that. So it gets its biggest size about that time. We don't talk about the thymus gland too much, but it's very important in terms of our immune system. Some of you have heard of you have heard that we have white blood cells, but we have specific types of white blood cells. We have some that are called neutrophils, and some that are called macrophages, and some that are called eosinophils. Well, that actually is a very important group to our specific immune response that we render, and they're called lymphocytes. And one of those types of lymphocytes are called T lymphocytes, and they get their name, that letter basically, the T in T lymphocyte, from where they kind of proliferate and where they mature, and a big part of that is the thymus gland. So the thymus gland is within the mediastinum. It would be inferior to the thyroid, so the thyroid would be superior to the thymus. So know those two locations. Now, our trachea and our esophagus, now these are pretty expansive pictures, I understand that. If I remember correctly, this graphic that came from the digestive system, the reason that some of these are in red isn't that you need to know them, it's that it's trying to identify within the digestive system what we classify as the accessory organs. In other words, the food starts in the oral cavity, gets chewed up, goes down the esophagus, into the stomach, small intestine, large intestine, goes out. Well, it comes into contact with secretions from a lot of other places. The salivary glands comes into contact with the teeth, the tongue, the pancreas secretes all sorts of secretions, the gallbladder and its release of bile that was produced by the liver. So that's why those are in red. It's not specifically we've asked you to know them, but I would know the relationship between the trachea and the esophagus. Now that makes it a little easier from our previous slide. We said, okay, well the thyroid gland sat, okay, which just inferior and lateral to, okay, the thyroid cartilage. And the thyroid cartilage, well, we can feel that. Okay, so I'm pushing on the thyroid cartilage that goes down the trachea. So the trachea is anterior and the esophagus is posterior. If you actually look in your book in the respiratory system, you'll see when it looks at the structure of the trachea is formed, and most of us have seen this, it has cartilaginous rings. And those rings are not continuous. They're not round. Okay, they're C-shaped. Well, they're round-ish, but they're C-shaped. And what it makes is a little indentation on the posterior side, and that's where the esophagus goes. And so the esophagus is posterior to the trachea, so the trachea would be anterior to the esophagus. So you want to know the relationships of those two. Now, if we look at the heart, we're going to look at it in detail next semester. We want to look at some of the what we call the great vessels. The great vessels, those arising from the heart. And so, or coming to or arising from, if we're looking at direction. And coming into the right side of the heart, we have the blood returning to the heart from above the heart, and it returns via the superior vena cava. The blood returning from below the heart, returning through the inferior vena cava. They come on the right side. Now, an easy way to remember which side is which is notice how the heart's tilted, and there's the point, or we call it the apex. The apex of the heart points left. And so I know that these two vessels are on the right side, and anything coming from over here is on the left side. And so we can name even some of the chambers if we wanted to. The top two chambers of the heart are called the atria. Okay, this would be the right atrium, the left atrium would be over here, and then the bottom two chambers would be the ventricles. Now, the division between those we can't see because it's not cut open, but we'd have the left ventricle over here, and we'd have the right ventricle over here. So we'd have superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and then coming off the left side, delivering that oxygenated blood to your body is the aorta. Now, the aorta actually has some specific regions. We refer to the part where it arises from the heart going up as the ascending aorta. We then talk about the aortic arch, and then we have the descending aorta. Now, it's not commonly thought about, well, how far does that aorta actually go? And your aorta is kind of like the main pipeline to your body from the standpoint of oxygenated blood. It's like if you go down in your basement and you see that little valve where the water comes into your house. That's the main pipeline of water coming from the culinary system and into your house. And then it branches off from there. It goes to this bathroom and that bathroom, and it goes to all 7 of your bathrooms. Just kidding, I don't know if you have 7 bathrooms, but okay, it goes to all the bathrooms, the kitchen, the laundry room, the garage sink, or wherever it's going to go. It gets distributed. That's the main pipeline coming into your house. Well, the aorta, from the standpoint of just received oxygenated blood from the lungs, and it wants to deliver that up to your head and your shoulders and your arms and your legs, everywhere in your body. And so it serves as a pipeline where everything else branches off. And so that descending aorta actually has a couple of parts. If it's above the diaphragm, we refer to it as the thoracic aorta. But still, it's going down, so it is the descending aorta. As it passes through the diaphragm, well, it's not in the thoracic cavity anymore, so we can't call it that anymore. So we call it the abdominal aorta. And the abdominal aorta, okay, will then branch down by your hips, and your hip bones is your ilium. And so we then branch into the iliac arteries, and then to the femoral arteries, and so on. But your aorta will go all the way down, okay, through your thoracic cavity. It goes right down towards your back, okay, and actually runs right along the vertebrae, okay, and then down through the diaphragm and into your abdominal cavity. So you can kind of get an idea of how big of a blood supply that is. Now the diaphragm, okay, that one's easy, but it is the structure that divides the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. Obviously the lungs and everything within the mediastinum would be above that. The abdominal pelvic cavities would be below that. Okay? The diaphragm's got a very unique structure. Okay? Notice its dome structure. And notice how it's kind of white here in the middle. We're going to talk about this when we get into both the muscular system as well as the respiratory system, that the way when a muscle contracts, muscles pull, they don't push. So when muscles contract, they always shorten, they don't lengthen. Now, if resistance is greater, okay, yeah, when you set something down on a table, your muscles are lengthening to do that, I understand. But your muscles are still shortening to create that resistance. So if we think about it, if muscles shorten when they contract, and the structure of the diaphragm, this is not important for this test, but it's kind of important to understand, especially later when we talk about this function. If you'll notice that the muscle fibers of the diaphragm attach to the central tendon of the diaphragm, and they're going to pull. So when they pull, it actually pulls this down. So when your diaphragm contracts, it actually flattens, and that's what allows you to inhale. And then when it relaxes, it goes up, and it actually allows you, or you exhale. And so it's kind of important to understand. Again, structure determines function. Okay, from a digestive standpoint, we have over here on the left side, we have the stomach. Over here on the right side, okay, we have our second biggest organ, skin being number one, but we have the liver hiding a little bit inferior, but mostly posterior. We have the gallbladder. We have the small intestine that encompasses large part of the abdominal cavity. We also have the large intestine. The large intestine connecting to the small intestine over here on the right side, okay, at the little pouch that hangs down, we call it the cecum. Hanging off the cecum, we have the appendix. And so when we name the parts of the large intestine, we actually have the cecum, or the pouch that hangs down, and then we have the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, and then where it makes a little S turn and moves posteriorly, we then have the sigmoid colon. So those are the parts of the large intestine we're going to name. But just know, for this section, just know kind of that lies throughout the abdominal cavity, that we have ascending on the right side, transverse, okay, just below the stomach and the liver, and then the descending down the left side. Okay? Make sure you kind of look at that relationship. Now, it's kind of nice that all of our digestive organs aren't just sitting in our abdominal pelvic cavity, okay, for two reasons. Number one, a functional standpoint, maybe more importantly from a vanity standpoint, because if you figure all your digestive organs weren't suspended or held and anchored into the abdominal pelvic cavity, well, everything would drop to the bottom. Okay, well, that'd be kind of horrible. Okay, nobody could have an abdomen that looked any good if everything sagged to the bottom. So there are membranes that actually hold and provide lubrication throughout the gastrointestinal tract to allow these organs to move without kind of rubbing on each other, because that would be pretty uncomfortable to us. Well, one of the prominent membranes that there is within the abdominal pelvic cavity is this structure called the greater omentum. Okay, it's anterior to all the abdominal organs. It connects up here at the top to the transverse colon, the stomach, and then like an apron. Now, it's actually kind of a double folded membrane. Okay, as we've talked about membranes within this unit, serous membranes, having that little bit of serous fluid between two layers, the deeper layer being the visceral layer, the more superficial layer being the parietal layer. Well, this is actually folded. This membrane folds down, so it has two layers, and then it comes back and does another fold. And so there's actually 4 layers there. And this structure is called the greater omentum. And notice it has a little bit of adipose tissue as well. No, if there's not extra adipose tissue, that's not a beer belly, okay? But it is a very fatty layer to provide energy for the abdominal organs. Now, it's just a matter of how much energy do we actually store there. Now, also within the abdominal cavity, we can see some of these structures from a cadaver view a little bit more closely. One of the relationships you've got to know its position, because we've taken the stomach out of the way, is the spleen. The spleen sits posterior to the stomach and lateral over by your ribs, okay, on the left-hand side. And that's why when somebody gets in an automobile accident and takes an impact, okay, to the abdominal cavity, very often the spleen takes a lot of that impact because of its position. It's somewhat protected posteriorly by the ribs, but it does take that impact, and so rupturing the spleen is a very life-threatening issue there. Now, if we look at the urinary system, the structures to know, okay, we have typically 2 kidneys. Okay, we have a right and a left arising from the kidneys. We have ureters. Okay, whether you're male or female, the ureter length is just based on body size, not gender. Taking the urine that was created by the kidney. Notice I said urine because there's a whole lot going on here in the kidney it changes it from what was blood, gets filtered, and then finally becomes urine right before it leaves the kidney. The urine then leaves the kidney down the ureters and drains into the base of the bladder. The bladder fills, and at a certain point sends a signal to your brain that says, hey, at some point in time, we got a given amount of volume in here. You may want to ponder, think about finding a restroom sometime soon. Okay, so it gives us kind of that warning. Our potty training kind of facilitates that for us, that we recognize that. If you wait too long, okay, well, there are valves that protect the bladder from emptying on its own. There are valves that protect you, but if the pressure in the bladder exceeds the valve pressure, the sphincter pressure specifically, yeah, that's when you got a little bit of an embarrassing issue. So the ureters drain the urine into the bladder. From the bladder, it drains through the urethra. Now, from the reproductive system, obviously there is a difference there between males and females, and we get into that a whole lot later. Okay, but we have the females, of course, structures producing their reproductive cells. We call them the gametes, or the ovaries. The ovaries, okay, through ovulation, release that gamete, goes into the uterine tubes, also commonly, less commonly now, referred to as the fallopian tubes, but the uterine tube, and then into the uterus. If the egg is not fertilized, of course, gets released with the normal menstrual flow out the vagina, and is released that way. In the males, we have the testes, and from the testes we have the vas deferens, so that the sperm can travel. Well, actually, the testes produce it. The epididymis is where they're stored, and they mature for a period of time. Up the vas deferens. This, of course, is the tube that's clipped and tied off, okay, in a vasectomy. Passes down and starts combining with accessory glands. We'll talk about those. Semen is created and then, of course, released. One of the unique structures with the male urethra is the fact that it is shared between the reproductive system. So it's not only a tube where semen is released, luckily not at the same time, as also the tube where urine is released. So those are those structures.